Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. A few more people might trickle in. We're thrilled that you came out this evening to participate in the panel discussion and also to hear Dr. Nadja Reilly speak. I'm Donna Tobin. I'm the principal of the Martha Jones School. I've been working with children and families from birth through middle school for over 35 years, which is a little bit hard to say. I used to always say 20 years for like 20 years. But now it's almost like 35 years. Anyway, I'd like to introduce Dr. Reilly. Dr. Reilly is the Associate Director of the Freedman Center for Children and Families at William James College. She completed her clinical training at Children's Hospital here in Boston. She's been a clinical psychologist for over 20 years. And she is the author of Anxiety and Depression in the Classroom, a teacher's guide for fostering self-regulation in young children. We have also had the benefit of having her collaborate with us here in Westwood. She's been working with the preschool through grade 5 teachers on our social emotional learning professional development. So those half Wednesdays that we spend in professional development are a terrific use of our time and the teachers' time, and we want to thank you for allowing that to happen in this district. We really appreciate the parent support of professional development, and it allows us to work with wonderful people like Dr. Reilly, so thank you. I'm going to have Dr. Reilly come up. I will introduce our panel when we get closer to the panel discussion. Also, I just want to point out a few things. There are some index cards around and some pens, so if anybody has any questions, as Dr. Reilly is speaking or as any of the speakers are talking, please feel free to jot down any questions that you have. We'll be collecting questions. Some of you submitted questions online, which was very helpful, so we'll also have those questions. I want to thank the principals that are here tonight, Josh Bomer from the Deerfield School and Sarah Cronin from Hamlin. Lisa Freedman is our K-5 Student Services Department Head. Plus we have our Assistant Superintendent, Allison Borchers, put this all together, so I want to give her a hand for making this happen. We have some of the teachers in the building as well, so that's really great. And what I missed. So thank you. We'll get started with Dr. Reilly, and then we'll head into our panel discussion.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody. It's been such a pleasure to be able to come into the town of Westwood and work with the teachers, with the staff. The sense of continuity that we have had from one meeting to another has been terrific. And of course, we know that social emotional learning includes that home and that parent piece. So we're thrilled to be able to do this kind of thing together. And I want to thank you for your time and being here. So I have the great privilege of kind of setting up the panel for tonight in talking about what is going on during this time of development for kids. What's happening from an emotional perspective, what do we see behaviorally, and how can parents and schools collaborate to make sure that we maximize opportunities to build resilience, but also recognize moments when kids are in distress from a prevention perspective. So we're not waiting until there's a crisis that's going on, but really learning how to recognize it and working on it together. So to set the stage for you, there are 3 moments in development where there are these huge bursts of growth. When they're little, in infancy, as you might remember when you had your little ones, between 0 and 3, their brains are growing at such an incredible rate. As a matter of fact, that's the time of most growth during our lifetime. And they're learning so many things. They're becoming curious, they're interacting with their environment, they're looking at us to figure out emotions and recognize facial expressions. Well, during the school age period, actually another moment of development like that occurs, but they're learning it in the context of other kids their age, and they're learning the piece that has to do with emotional awareness and regulation and social problem solving. And those are really big areas that during this time, if we set a very good foundation for how to recognize their emotions, how to label them and tell us, how to implement good coping skills, those that area of growth will actually benefit the next period in development, which is during adolescence, when they're getting rid of things that they don't need, right? So they learned how to tie their shoes, they got that one figured out. I can get rid of those connections and I can make some more important ones, like how do I keep myself well, emotionally healthy? So the foundations that we set at this time make a huge impact into adolescence and into adulthood. And so when we talk about building resilience, we're actually talking about a lifelong learning process that really has its fundamental beginnings in infancy, but very importantly during this age. So let's take a look a little bit about what's going on for them from the inside out. So if we take a look at their prefrontal cortex, that's the area right up here that allows us to inhibit behavior that we don't want, right? So you're sitting in the classroom and you really feel like getting up and you feel like moving around, but you know that you can't. It helps with problem solving. It helps with judgment. So all of those things between 5 and 8 years are actually emerging. So that's when you start seeing kids being able to sustain attention longer, they're able to learn in different ways. But that is still growing, and their executive functions won't be fully developed until they're in their early 20s. So it's really important to know that, because sometimes you might have some little ones that are extremely bright, you might have some adolescents that are extremely bright, and yet they do things that leave you like, what? What were you thinking? What was going on? So the executive functions are not fully as developed as their emotional selves will be. And it's important to think about that when they have big feelings, when they have big emotions, and they feel them all over, but might not be able to stop themselves at a particular moment, or might not know what the best strategy is. And that's where we come in that family and school partnership, to be able to give them the language for it and the skills to be able to build over time. From an attachment perspective, school-age kids are more able to do things independently, and of course that is based on the foundation that they have very secure attachment and good relationships with their caretakers, their parents. But something that happens during this time is another kind of attachment, and that is the attachment that they develop to other important adults in their lives. And during the school year, that means their teachers, right? They spend a lot of time together with their school teachers. They develop very strong attachments to them. And so one of the things that we've been talking about in the professional development workshops is the importance of that teacher-student relationship. And so I want to really highlight that, because if there is somebody else that they have formed a really good attachment with, a very trusting relationship, it's even more important that there be really good communication between the parents and the teachers, so that there can be continuity of the skill building. Whether the kids are doing great and developing without any difficulties, but especially if they're encountering any sort of distress. One of the things that we know is for kids to feel emotionally regulated, having that predictability, having that continuity is critical. And I just want to share an example from my own life. So I have 2 sons, and my younger son during elementary school was experiencing a lot of anxiety. And one of the best things that I did was actually sit down with his teacher and say, okay, this is the way that it manifests in my house and in the mornings. Tell me what you're seeing and what can we do together. This is what works at home. Let me tell you about that so you can do it in the classroom. Tell me what you're doing in your classroom so I can do it at the house too. And what I found was that the transitions from the home to the school were a lot easier. And there were also more communications that helped me figure out how to help with homework or other things that might naturally bring about anxiety. So that piece, I can't emphasize enough how helpful it can be. So self-regulation. This is a really big topic right now. How many of you have been hearing things about how to foster self-regulation and how to foster emotional health and well-being? So Traditionally, when people talk about self-regulation, it has a lot to do with kind of behavioral regulation, being able to kind of pay attention and stay still and, not get into trouble in the classroom. But more than just the behavioral part, one of the most critical parts of self-regulation is actually emotional regulation. And that is made up of awareness. So if I'm feeling frustrated, I know what it is, I can recognize what's going on, and I can say that to somebody. Kids around this age are actually able to do some of this, but they need more coaching. So how many of you have, gotten home and you see your kids and you're like, so, how's your day? How are you? What do you get? Fine, good, right? There isn't a lot of, difference or a wide range of emotional vocabulary, if you will. So when we think about how to raise resilient kids, a really important way is to help them practice their emotional vocabulary. First, to recognize that they're having big feelings and be able to tell you, and then be able to have them label them. Now, what research tells us is that when kids are able to label their emotions, the intensity of those big feelings actually comes down. So instead of having this full-on meltdown where you're trying to figure out how a child is feeling but you're not getting anything, a child that's able to use more emotion words won't have that same level of intensity and can actually come down from that a little bit faster. So again, we're thinking prevention. We start finding opportunities for building emotional vocabulary. And you can do that by doing things like modeling, how your day was, what some of your emotions were. You can offer some suggestions when they're telling you how they're feeling or how their day went. Or when they're telling you stories about what was going on with their friends. Wondering together about, well, what do you think was going on for this person? Or, gee, that sounds like she was feeling kind of overwhelmed. What do you think? And you're sharing ideas and emotional talk and regulation. From a social perspective taking point, so they're able to take on other people's perspectives. They're able to understand that when they're feeling happy, perhaps somebody else is feeling sad or upset. But sometimes it's one thing to understand that, it's another thing to then act upon that. So, for example, if they get into an argument with a friend, they might understand that the friend is upset, but it feels like too much to then say, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to my friend and I'm going to figure out a plan for how to repair that. So, because they're still managing their own feelings, they understand that somebody else might be feeling a different way, but they might be feeling sad or hurt. And so, resilience is about saying, okay, so you're feeling this particular way, how can we connect? As parents, as teachers, what we can do is help them make those bridges that offer ideas about what can we do, what are some possibilities, and then help them try it on, do a little bit of role playing before actually going into the situation. Pro-social skills are actually really growing and developing during this time, and what the resilience literature tells us is that when kids are able to engage in some activity that is for the good of others, or some activity that has kind of a bigger meaning or purpose, it actually serves as a protective factor and it helps to build resilience. So things like delivering meals during Thanksgiving, or things like, creating something that you're going to send to a particular group in need. All of those opportunities are actually incredibly helpful to build their pro-social skills, but also to build a sense of purpose, agency, and resilience. So, my friend Tigger here, I love Winnie the Pooh. You can learn a lot of great lessons from them. And Tigger says life is not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. And so resilience is not about the lack of distress or not ever going through something difficult, but it's actually the process of learning from difficult times and being able to take that information and use it to manage other times that will be difficult that might come up. A lot of times kids might get the sense that they're not supposed to get upset, or they're not supposed to be angry, or they're not supposed to have a different range of emotions. And actually what we want them to know is that it's okay to have those feelings. It's how you manage them and how you use that learning that makes one resilient. So they have a lot of tasks that they have to complete during this time. And some of these things are not easily negotiated. So they have to develop self-esteem and grow more confident. And that means they have to try on kind of different identities for who they're going to be and what group they're going to fit into. They have to make new friends, but they also have to maintain friendships. And for those of you who have kids around 4th or 5th grade, you know how tricky it can get when those friend groups change, when somebody feels left out. That can be a trying time for them. They have to take reasonable risks. Here's another piece for resilience. If you hear things like, I'm not going to try that, that's too hard, or I'm just going to stick with this because I know I'm going to be able to do it, we want them to go out of that comfort zone. We want them to have what's called a growth mindset, where they take on challenges, not because they know they're going to succeed, but because they love being challenged. They're like, this is tough, I'm going to try it out just because I want to meet that challenge. And that's the kind of thinking that fosters resilience, because if you keep yourself in a safe zone and you don't try anything because it's too hard or you might not know someone, then it's going to keep your range of opportunities, problem solving, and confidence actually more limited. So encourage exploration, encourage failure, have a language that really focuses on the process rather than on the outcome. So, you know what? You worked so hard at that project. I'm really proud of how you focused on it and you planned it and you did that. So you're not praising the number, that's the outcome, but you're really praising that process. So as I've been mentioning, what can you give? Well, one of the things is acknowledgments of feelings and kind of talking about them. And you might need to find some creative ways to do this, right? Because it's not many kids who will want to sit down one-on-one and just kind of have a conversation about how they're feeling. But play is a great way to do that, kind of talking through playing, or while you're walking, or going to get some frozen yogurt. Those moments when they're feeling like all the attention is not on me to see how I'm feeling, but we're just kind of having more conversation. Those are the moments when you tend to get a lot. Full attention. So I have to confess I've been guilty of this. I've been on my phone returning emails when my kids are like, Mom, how about this? And Mom, and I've been called out. Can you please put your phone down? I'm trying to talk to you. And you know what? Some of these moments, they might not require full-on eye contact because that can feel a little bit like too much, but definitely full attention where the message that they're getting is, this is my only priority at this moment, and you have my time and my attention. Predictable interactions. So there's a lot that feels really good about boundaries and predictability for kids this age, but I think in general, I think for adolescents too. But predictability in terms of how you handle emotions, or how you regulate yourself, and then how you model that for the kids. Space for independent problem solving. This is a really important one. Again, I have been there as a mom. It's really hard to watch my kids struggle. It's really hard to watch them be sad or be in pain or feel like they can't find their way around something. But sometimes taking a little step back, being present, of course, and listening, but taking a little step back before rushing in to solve for them can be incredibly helpful in two ways. One, it helps them to tolerate that feeling of distress. It helps them to learn how to do that, and that's a really critical skill. But it also gives the message that you have confidence that together you can find a way to solve things. It just won't be somebody else solving for them. They are going to be an active participant in trying to figure things out. Identifying triggers, you might want to help them just kind of as, matter of course, like, I noticed that when you have a lot of tests at once, it really stresses you out. Have you noticed that? Or I noticed that when, there's a lot going on with your friends and you're feeling kind of left out, you get really cranky. How does that feel for you? And what you're doing is being curious and noticing things with them. But that helps them actually notice their own patterns, and it can be extremely helpful, again, for that emotional awareness. And then practicing ways to tolerate distress. So think about for yourselves, like, what do you do when you're really stressed out? Just picture yourself at work, and you really want to send that email. Like, that mean email, because you're really angry, you want to send that. What do you do to kind of distress, right? Maybe you get up and you go get a drink of water, or maybe you get up and you walk around a little bit, or maybe you talk to somebody. Kids need that same kind of practice as well to figure out how they're going to ride that wave of emotion. One trick I like to use for kids is to tell them the 3-3-3 rule. So you're feeling really, really intense right now. Can you just wait 3 seconds? Because in 3 seconds, you're going to feel a little different than you do right now. And if you get through that, can you wait 3 minutes? And in 3 minutes, you're going to feel different than how you felt just 3 seconds ago. And then if you can get through that, how about we wait 3 hours? And that helps them to kind of chunk it into smaller pieces and be able to tolerate distress that way. Okay, so I'm going to recruit all of you to be their emotional coaches. And for those of you who might have high schoolers, this is a really great model to follow with them as well. Facilitating self-reflection is really important. So that means that conversations are more like, okay, so tell me more about what happened. So, what was the scoop? It's a very broad, open-ended question that invites them to tell you their version of the story before you even get like who did what happened, who said what. You're just getting them to reflect on what happened for a little bit. And then you follow that up with learner questions instead of judger questions. Now, if you had to guess, what do you think is a judger question?
Why?
Sorry?
Why?
Why? Why'd you do that? Whose fault was it? Who started this? It's usually a closed-ended question, and there's usually some outcome in terms of trying to figure out where the blame might be. Learner questions are more like, so what was this person's role? Or what happened after? Or what was your side of the story? Or how did you see it? It's more about getting information, because one of the biggest points where we get into trouble from a communication perspective with kids is that we're going in to problem solve, right? Okay, let me figure out what's going on, then we're not plan A, plan B, and plan C. But actually, the way they process something that just happened is by telling you the story like 50 times. Do you have any kids who will tell you what happens and they're like, let me tell you, and you're like, yeah, I know, I've heard it like 20 times already. But each time they retell the story, they're actually integrating it in a different way and in a helpful way. So rushing in with problem solving actually gets in the way of that process for them. And then use humor and playfulness. Sometimes when it's a really heated moment and you're feeling yourself getting kind of dysregulated too, it's usually the point where you're feeling the need to say, somebody's right, or because I said so. It's usually at that point where using some sort of humor or being silly, letting your guard down a little bit can actually be incredibly helpful. So instead of continuing to butt heads, it gives you a moment to step back from the situation and then come back more calmly. So what works? We know that all of those strategies at home work. We know that a lot of the things that are going on at school work, but what works best is when we're able to combine these things together, right? When what you're doing at home and you're really finding it helpful, share that with your teacher, and when teachers share with you. So we know that if we're feeling lonely or if we're feeling like we're not in a good relationship, our feelings are going to suffer. If our brains are lonely, our feelings are going to definitely have that. So the power of relationships is incredibly helpful. So fostering that very trusting and positive relationship, not just with the kids and the teachers, but with the parents and the teachers, is really important. So I just wanted to share some research with you. This is how important relationships are. For kids who might be struggling with depression, parental support is actually associated with lower symptoms of depression. So not even treatment, but just knowing that you can say what's going on and that somebody's going to accept you unconditionally. Peer support is associated with higher academic self-efficacy. And connection to teacher support is associated with all of those outcomes. So it's actually incredibly powerful. So what should you do if you're thinking, something's been going on, or I'm a little worried? The first thing I would tell you is always listen to your gut. You know your child well, and if you're feeling like something's going on, a preventive approach is always most helpful. So you might want to set up an appointment with a pediatrician just to make sure that from a medical perspective everything's okay. But then after that, don't be afraid to say, I'm noticing something's going on. Tell me. Right? Don't be afraid to point out changes that you might have noticed. Oh, sorry. I don't know what I just did. Hold on. So maybe you can scroll it? Okay, thank you. I'm terrible. You should never put a remote in my hand. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Allison. Okay. So you've checked with a pediatrician, you've talked with your child, and then the other thing I would say is be very transparent in the communication. So say, I'm going to talk with your teacher. Don't have it be a secret. Have it be a collaborative process. They might fight you on it initially because of feeling embarrassed, or they might feel like, oh, I don't want my teacher to know what's going on. But it's always better to present things in a very transparent and collaborative way where they feel held and supported. They're not the ones who have to make the decisions around who gets told what when. When you take that responsibility off of them, it's actually much better for them. And I would encourage you to just maintain that ongoing collaboration. As I mentioned to you with my son, I started that collaboration in fourth grade. He's in 7th grade now, and what I do is at the beginning of every year, I connect with teachers. And I talk, we have a great conversation about, this is how he is, and then we check in. And I have found that preventive approach has been really helpful, not just for him, but for me too, because I feel really comforted that there's another set of caring eyes on my son. So I really encourage you to reach out, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. So we have our panel here tonight. We have Danielle Sutton from Westwood Youth and Family Services. We have Claire Dorman, who is a special education teacher here in the Westwood Public Schools, focusing on working with children with social and emotional needs. And we have Dr. Glen Atkinson, who is the K-5 department chair for our Student Services Department for Martha Jones, Hamlin, and Deerfield. And Lisa Freedman is for Sheehan and Downey. She's in the audience. And we have a few questions. So there are cards coming around. If you have questions, you can write them down and we'll collect them, or we will have some questions other ways too if people want to ask them. But we do have a few questions that we collected. Some of you wrote in, as you saw on the flyer, and some of the communications that went home from school. So that's great. So why don't we start with Claire? How do you encourage, so one of the first question was, how do you encourage kids to continue to be kind, inclusive to others, etc., when so often other kids don't behave that way towards them?
Well, in the school, can you hear me okay? Yes. Yes, okay. Within the school setting, different things that we do are focused around self-awareness, so thinking about how I feel about something, and also social awareness. So when I see something going on, what kind of feelings does that give me? And oftentimes within the school setting, we do that through perspective taking. So thinking about, providing a situation to a student and then saying, well, how did, Billy feel when he wasn't included at the lunchroom table? What would you have done if you were in that situation? What might have happened if someone went over and said, oh, Billy, come sit with me? Just to get students to try to become flexible thinkers. We also try to have students understand that all of your behavior causes other people to have thoughts about you. So if I do something kind for someone, they're going to have a positive thought about me, and I'll feel positive about myself. If I do something negative, somebody might have a negative thought about me, resulting in me also not feeling too great about myself. So teaching kids that kindness and empathy don't need to be this big, grand gesture, but just doing small things, and then providing students and children with the opportunity to really stop and think about it. So how did it make you feel when you gave a note to Ms. Tobin saying, have a great day? How do you think that made Ms. Tobin feel? Just kind of having that open conversation with students is something that we do within our school day, and I would encourage you to do too.
Thank you. And the next one is for Glen. How do you encourage your child to be resilient with new or uncomfortable situations, be it academic, social, or extracurricular activities such as a dance or sports that cause performance anxiety?
Okay. So I want to take that in two parts. First, resilience, and I want to sort of back away from that tense moment a little bit, and then I'll talk about the tense moment. Developing resilience is a long-term project. So a study of over 10,000 kids, taking a look at kids who had very significant negative histories, very, very significant negative histories. And what they found was that looking at them 20 and 30 years later, about 80% of them actually had really good outcomes. And I said, well, what's the difference between the two groups? And they were able to break it down into 7 factors. And if that helped those students with very significant negative early experiences, it's going to be particularly powerful for somebody who doesn't. So I'm just going to name a couple of them. Under this idea that it's important to make this a long-term project and intervene long before you sort of hit that moment of anxiety. So one of them is islands of mastery, and that is that there was somebody in their life that celebrated something that they did really well. I often use myself as an example. So I'm sort of tall and thin, and those who know me, I'm like Forrest Gump. I like to run. My parents had said, the Atkinsons were fullbacks on the football team, and that's what you're going to do. That's going to end really, really badly. What they did was say, hey, look at him, he loves to run, isn't that awesome? And they celebrated that up. And so finding those places where your child has enthusiasm and love and just really embracing that. Another is connection to community, which is not joining a committee for Westwood. It's instead you're a community, the classroom is a community. And it could be as simple as having a chore and then celebrating them completing that chore. So the example I sometimes give is my daughter, who's now an engineer in London, very independent. Her job was to empty the dishwasher. And I could have come home tired at the end of the day and just said, oh yeah, that's awesome, she did it. But I tried to really make a point of celebrating her up and sort of loving her up. And I'd come home and I'd go, oh, you're the best. Love that phrase, by the way, instant grin. I needed a cup of coffee, long day at work today. I thought, I ordered many cups, and you took care of the dishwasher. That's just the best. making the point that here she is at whatever age, that she was influencing the community, the family community, and me in a positive way. And the last one that I'll just point to is connection to a non-therapist, non-parent, adult, most often a teacher, who I call your attachment partner. They're the attachment partner for the hours that your child is away, which will kind of lead me to that hot moment. Okay, they're in their anxious moment about academics or sports or something. So a couple of thoughts. I'd listen to their worry, echoing something that Nadja had said. Listen for the emotional vocabulary. Listen for vocabulary that's on the more extreme end, the worry words, and helping them use more nuanced words to develop that vocabulary. Model that it can be tolerated. Model your own emotional reactions. Even though you may be worried, oh, this is going to be hard for them. They're watching you watch them. They're looking at your cues. Reinforce to them that they can handle it. Suggest that they talk to their teacher, your attachment partner. One of the things that helps me, so my training is in neuropsychology, and I actually tend to think in these terms. There's a part of our brain, the amygdala, that mediates fight or flight. Don't talk to that anxious part. If you talk to that anxious part, you talk to the anxiety, you're going to grow the anxiety. You talk to the frontal lobes, you talk to the part that can handle it, which are some of the examples that you were giving there. And I'll end on this. Really what you're doing is, there was a study of Harvard graduates over 30 or 40 years. And in my field, Nadja's field, years ago, we used to think that things like defense mechanism, protection, oh, scary, we shouldn't do those, they're all really bad. But what they found was that these really successful people engaged defense mechanisms in varying degrees and in varying forms. And in fact, some of them are really healthy. And the one that I'm going to point to is anticipatory anxiety. That it's actually very healthy to worry about the thing that's coming, because then you prepare for it. So when they're in that moment, worrying about the thing that's coming, listen to them, let them talk it through, help them prepare for it, but don't necessarily rush in. I was talking to a very experienced third grade teacher today, and I asked her, I said, hey, I'm going to come to this panel, and I'm not sure the questions that I'll get. What's the one thing that comes to mind for you for resilience? And this very experienced teacher said, controlled floundering. What she would like is for parents to allow their child to be able to come in, maybe not have the snack, maybe not have the homework, learn from the experience, to then be able to adapt when something comes along further in their life. That's going to be much more important than whatever that homework was. And I can tell you, she's got a drawer full of snacks, and that can be solved. So.
Thank you. Our next question is for Danielle. Looking ahead at the transition to middle school into 6th grade, how do parents and schools reinforce kindness and resiliency with preteens and teens who tend to be more self-focused?
So I think, you've already laid an amazing foundation with all those great pointers from elementary folks. And so a lot of it is going to be just continuing in that same vein. I think the schools do a lot. I had actually been jotting down some notes about that. So you'll see at the middle school, there's lots of campaigns and focus on doing the right thing, being the change, and standing up if you see a situation that isn't okay. There's lots of things there. Back in the day, there was a kudos wall. I'm looking at you, sporters, that celebrated kids who kind of did something a little different to help somebody out. So there's lots of things that have always happened at the middle school and that continue to happen that really celebrate students for making those good decisions and really promote that kind of thinking. It's not letting them just become internalized, but making them think still about the social situation. There's also curriculum. I think about all of the amazing stories and books that they'll read, all of the different lessons in all of their classes, not just in literature, that really reinforce this idea of, doing the right thing, doing the thing that's hard, and having resilience coming through difficult odds. And they love those stories, and they're reading them. So the curriculum supports what's going on, what they've been learning in their elementary years as well. And then there's also things that might be different from the time we were all in middle school. There's things like advisory group, where kids get together at some point during their day with kids that they might not usually, same age peers that they might not usually connect with in their social circles, and they meet regularly with that group of kids and with a certain teacher, and they're all broken up into these groups, and it's a time to connect and to talk through issues and to really make connections and increase kindness and resilience in a natural kind of way, and kids report really enjoying that experience, and so that's a great thing that's happening in the schools. And then there's a lot of collaboration. I work for a town department, Youth and Family Services, and we collaborate with the schools to bring some of those campaigns and some of those things like bullying prevention theater, the Recognizing Youth Awards that we do with the Rotary Group. So lots of things happening in school and in the community to support everything that we're talking about here tonight. And then I think, when I think about, okay, well, what's different for a parent who's talking to a 6th grader or a 7th grader versus, some of the stuff that Nadja was talking about with the younger kids, I just think it's just a little bit more of a balancing act with that active listening, right? So everything that people have talked about with leaving room for a little bit of struggle and letting kids figure it out with natural consequences, even more so as they head into middle school. And also that idea, someone said something once, and I thought it was kind of so profound in this simple way. It was a speaker years ago who came to Westwood, and they said, my best advice for parents of preteens and teens is to say, do you want me to listen or do you want advice? On what we're talking about, or it's to say that at the beginning or the end, and they're like, oh, I just want you to listen. And you're like, oh, great, now I know what to do, because we all do jump into a problem-solving mode, and that lets you know what they're needing at that time, and often, especially when they're getting more independent in those middle school years, they just want you to listen as they tell and process that story and that situation. They don't necessarily want as much of the, language around like learning, like the learner language that you talked about. So that's a great piece of advice. I think something else that Nadja had brought up is that idea of not, necessarily making them the focus. So parents will say, oh, I get all my information when I'm driving. So I'll drive to any appointment anywhere, right? Or I'll drive any kids to any dances anytime, because they're all in the back talking, or on the way to the orthodontist, I can say, hey, how'd that situation go with so-and-so? And we're gonna have a much more rich conversation if we're not sitting across from each other and looking at each other. I see lots of people nodding. You've heard this one before. Another parent talked about sitting in a dark room, not looking at each other. Their child bounced a ball against a wall, and that was what they did, and it worked. Their child could do something. They didn't have to be looking at each other, but they could talk through issues that way. So I think some helpful tips as kids are becoming more independent. 2 other things that I'll say quickly. I think continuing with those ideas, volunteer opportunities for middle school, for everyone, have been shown to decrease stress and to decrease symptoms of anxiety and depression, but they also give you a real sense of perspective taking and a sense of resiliency and reinforced kindness. So any volunteer opportunities that they can do on their own or with a group of peers is fantastic. There was an idea that came through Patrick Sweeney, who works for Westwood Mansfield Pediatrics. People might see those emails. He talked about a tolerance journal where if someone didn't feel like they could tolerate certain things or deal with certain issues, maybe they would keep a journal, just like gratitude journals that we've heard about. A journal where they talk about each day one thing that they got through, they weren't sure they were going to be able to get through. And I think, why couldn't you use that around resiliency, right? Like, if you're not feeling particularly resilient or you feel like you've hit a dead end, why don't you spend some time thinking about things that you have gone through and how you did that? And I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Going down a little bit in grade, but I think we see this sometimes, unfortunately, at many grades. But the question, maybe Dr. you can take this one, is talking about the mean girls attitude, and it seems to be increasing starting in 1st and 2nd grade. We used to think of mean girls as middle school, which is kind of a horrible term in of itself, mean girls, but I think we do hear that phrase a lot. And so thinking about it with 1st and 2nd grade is, this person wrote, we teach kindness, we display kindness in our home and in our own actions, but it seems that many young girls tend to act with an attitude of superiority, dismissiveness, kind of a haughty nature. And is this a phase of experimenting, or how do we navigate this at home when children have a tendency to act like this in our home?
So, yes, we are seeing that in younger ages. That's why earlier I mentioned.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Take this moment to turn
turn both mics on, just. There's a little red button. That'll come on in just a second.
Can you hear me? No?
I think you should.
Yes, I need it really close. There we go. So we're definitely seeing that, unfortunately, in younger ages. One of the things that I would reinforce is what you were mentioning earlier in terms of the curriculum that you're using for self-awareness and social awareness. Sometimes we really focus on the piece of, don't behave that way or behave this way, but it's very one-sided. It's always important when you're talking about these kind of social situations to present both sides and to say, what is your perspective? How do you think the other person is feeling? How is that person seeing this? What have you noticed about when you do this or you do that? The other piece is I would really encourage us to be reflective too in terms of what might we be reinforcing in some ways that they might feel like girls are supposed to be in a particular way. So, is it around how they look, or is it around how they dress, or is it, is the attention coming from physical stuff or particular things that they might be receiving unintentionally more positive reinforcement for some of those things. So I think a mixture of trying to think what's happening in the environment that might be kind of reinforcing that or fueling that a little bit. How are we celebrating other girls, but certainly other boys, because this happens with boys too, who might not fit into that traditional look or track, and how are we celebrating those differences rather than just one particular thing. So again, when we think about that social emotional learning perspective, it's really something that encourages us to take a look at what's going on in the community, what's going on in the home, in the school, in that peer group, so that we can really tackle it, not just from saying, don't do that, but really thinking about what other supports can we have and put in place that will allow bigger behavior change.
Thank you. Claire, maybe you can take this next one, because I know that this is probably how you spend most of your day. What are some of the strategies for children to self-regulate in the classroom without being too disruptive? And it could be, I think, in the classroom this question is directed towards, but I think that many parents might see this in other places, the restaurant, you're visiting a friend's house, or at different times like that.
So within the classroom, we as teachers I guess I can't speak for all teachers, but I know for myself and the teachers I'm fortunate to work with, have a lot of flexibility in teaching students. Oh, sorry. We have a lot of.
You got to get very close.
Can you hear me now? All right, I'll try that. I'll put the teacher voice on if I need to. But we have a lot of flexibility in helping students to realize kind of what their body needs or what their mind needs. So as you are all sitting here now, you're doing things to self-regulate yourself, whether that's crossing your legs, maybe you're chewing gum, maybe you're having a little bit of water. We allow that within our classroom to help students recognize those things. I have gum available in my classroom, and it's not gum because I want a candy break. It's gum because that's a learning tool that works for some students. Sometimes gum doesn't work for everyone, and sometimes students have mint instead to kind of give them that little pep up that they might need. Some students take power walks, and it's not just to get out of the classroom, it's because their mind is going and they just need a little bit of an outlet, so providing that opportunity for them. So allowing students to kind of reflect on their own behavior and their own needs is very important. So if you are going out to dinner and you have this common thing that comes up, talking with the student and saying, I'm noticing we have a hard time after, you finish eating, you have a hard time sitting and waiting for everyone else to be done. Do you have any ideas on what we could do together so that you're able to stay at the table, and have them kind of generate some ideas and then try it and offer opportunities for practicing that? And just that really role playing and really talking about it and notice things and stating your noticings is very important for them, but that's also building on their ability to self-monitor and their own self-awareness, which is a very important skill that they need to develop.
Thank you. Danielle, what are the best strategies to help kids work through or combat negative self-talk, such as saying, I am stupid and I hate myself?
So best strategies for negative self-talk.
Do you want to take the mic?
Oh, sure, yeah. Can you guys hear me? All right. So when I when I think of kind of go-to or best strategies for negative self-talk, I think the first thing is to acknowledge and normalize with anything, right? Like, so this is something that everyone does sometimes, right? We go to a negative place, and to let them know that these things are connected, right? So people have heard the term like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That, and basically what that means is that thoughts and feelings and behaviors are connected. So helping to just talk about that connection. So normalizing, providing a little bit of education around like, yeah, like when we're thinking those negative thoughts, it often changes how we're behaving in the situation, right? So imagine this situation, if you're thinking all of these negative thoughts, how might you act? You know, oh, well, I might, you know, throw something or do this, or I might just stop trying, right? Well, what if we changed the conversation, right? And what if, when you have that thought, we kind of counteracted it with another thought? How might that change your behavior, right? So if you were thinking, you know, okay, I can't do this, I'm never gonna get it. What if you said, I didn't get it this time, right? Everybody doesn't get it, like the first time. It might take multiple times. What might you do instead? Well, instead of giving up, I might try again, right? So you can walk through these things. And with young kids, sometimes we'll do, you know, we'll write out a situation, right? We'll do it almost like a little comic strip. Like, you know, here's the way that you were thinking, and here's what it led to, right? And what's a different way that you could think about it, and how might that lead? That idea of like, we're kind of drawing out or coming at this creatively, like what's a different way to do this? I think those strategies can be helpful. So acknowledging, just providing a little bit of education, and then coming up with some ways to talk about reframing and how that can change our behavior and our outcome.
And one, just
Yeah,
to
that's
add
what I
on
did.
to an extension of that,
Yeah.
in the heat of the moment, they may not be able to engage in
Right.
a lot of that. A strategy sometimes that I'll use is, this is important, I want to remember this, and I'll repeat the phrase. Let's remember this, we're going to talk about it later, when they can look back and say, okay, I thought the world was going to end, it didn't in fact end. So now, next time that happens, we're going to remember this, so that we can think about possibly changing it, sort of giving a chapter 2 to the whole thing when they're not ready in the heat of the moment. I know if I'm feeling stressed, I'm not like in a place to learn right there, so.
I think that's great.
Great. So Glen, do you want to follow up? How can you encourage taking risks and be having a child be okay with failing?
So a couple thoughts come to mind. Long-term model taking risks and model things not working out for yourselves, and what positive can come from that. You could use the trick of talking to a spouse on the phone. You may not actually be on the phone. When they're right in the other room, you know, hey, I had this happen today. Or talk about something that your child did, and then they did such and such, to bounce back, so reinforcing the positiveness of what they did.
Great.
Can I just?
Yep.
I would also say, practice that first in what feels like a low stakes situation. They might not be willing to engage in that kind of thinking if they're feeling like, no, I really have to do, I can't fail in that test, like that's just not an option. So you might want to think about what's low stakes that they can kind of practice those skills. So maybe it's, you know, going somewhere new that they haven't been, and they have to introduce themselves to somebody, or, you know, they have to do something that the outcome to them doesn't feel so incredibly important at the moment, but it helps them to approach a new situation. It helps them have that memory, like you were mentioning, like, remember when you did that and it worked well? And then you build up on that so that when it does come to a high stakes situation, they're feeling like, well, that's okay, I can try that. And I think that ties into what you were saying, which is that allows them to be able to have a more realistic change of negative thoughts. A lot of times kids think that changing a negative thought to a positive thought means everything's gonna be fine. And in fact, it's not that it's a naive kind of positive thought, it's more something that has a mechanism for change. So I didn't do so well in this test, but now, the next time that I have a test, I'm gonna talk to the teacher. And that's changing a negative thought. It gives them a sense of agency. But just like you were mentioning, don't try to do this when you're really stressed out. Same thing, practice these skills when it feels like it's more low stakes and then build up to it.
I can actually add to that too. Within the classroom, I run a lot of social groups, and we play the game Jenga, which we all know, right? So you play Jenga, but instead of having it be like a competition to who's going to have it all crumble, we kind of pep each other up. So as you're pulling out the pieces and putting it on top, eventually it's going to fall. And that student, we don't want that student to feel like, oh no, I'm the one that knocked down the Jenga tower. So we play that game and we talk about, well, what happens when it falls? We just rebuild it and we start again. So I have had students that have that kind of perfectionistic quality and that fear of failure, and I've referred back to that game, like, oh, remember with Jenga? You were the one that knocked it down, and everyone said, it's okay, and you just rebuilt it. So it's a very kind of simple game, something that we're all really familiar with, but it was that low stakes game playing. I said somebody's going to knock it down. What are we gonna do when we knock it down? We talked about it before it happened. So having those kind of opportunities for students too.
Actually, a good segue. Did anybody here see the article on Google? It was in several publications, Washington Post or others. So, in short, the founders of Google, Glen and Page, had started out with the idea that the best way to build a company was to create a hiring algorithm in which you determined who had the most hard science knowledge, who went to this particular school, who had the highest GPA, who studied under this computational neuroscientist, blah, 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 blah. And so they would go out and hire all these people, and being really good scientists, they said, well, let's go back and see if that actually worked. And what they found was that that wasn't true, that of all the factors that predicted success of their employees, the hard science knowledge was actually the lowest. And the ones that were the highest were the things that we're talking about here. Empathy, supporting other people. So they took it to the next level and they said, let's look at our teams, because they had this prize team called the A-Team, where they had like the smartest people in the room. Put them in the room, let them solve the problems. And what they found was they weren't producing the most. It was the B teams that were producing the most. And the difference between the A teams and the B teams, apart from GPA, what school, or this, that, and the other, was that the B team was more heavily composed of people who were empathic toward one another, who were positive and supportive to one another. So building all of that soft skill, if you were, is almost the meta curriculum that takes things like the STEM, science, and all of that, and makes it work in real life. And so to see a company as profound and successful as Google sort of finding its way around to that solution, I think is really powerful for what we're doing, all of us together as partners.
We do have a few wrap-up questions, but I want to see if anybody has any other questions, or if you have any cards or any questions.
I have a question. You mentioned a lot of good skills that kids can do, journaling and that kind of stuff. What age is the right age to introduce like meditation or mindfulness?
Did everyone hear the question?
Well, no, you can go ahead. I was going to repeat the question.
Thank you. Yes.
He asked what age it's good to introduce mindfulness or meditation.
So I might be a little biased, but I think early is great, because there still isn't some of the stigma maybe that some people might attach to it, or some of the different expectations. And when you do something to introduce mindfulness, it can be done in a very active way. It doesn't have to be that you're sitting there kind of meditating, but it can be mindful walking, it can be mindful playing, it can be mindful cooking, and so when you introduce that concept early on, it allows for more practice and more kind of absorbing of those skills. So I think, little ones really do benefit from it, and actually tend to take to it really well, and they like it. So in all sorts of different forms, whether it's even coloring, yoga, any kind of connection where they are really centered in the moment is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, that I think mindfulness practices can start as early as you possibly can, and I had the opportunity to go to a mindfulness workshop that was put on with Early Childhood Council in Westwood, and it was amazing. You had about 20 kids under 8 and under, and they were sitting so, like, I wondered how this would be, right? You get all these kids, yeah, they were so into it, and they were doing things like breathing like a bunny, where you go like that, and they were doing things, they did a mindful eating activity, which I actually just recently redid in a first grade classroom, and we spent 5 minutes kind of like checking out this raisin, and smelling the raisin and listening to the raisin and putting the raisin on our tongue, and then we talked about it afterwards, and they totally got it, and they were totally into it, and they thought it was fun, and they said things like, I said, what would it be like if we did this with other things, right? And he said, it would be like a new experience. And I was like, it would. Like, so I think they're really into it, and as early as you can. We do things like blowing bubbles, like bubble breathing, where you have to breathe in and breathe out slowly to like make the bubble grow. Things like, there's tons. If you went online, you can find a ton of resources, and teachers have a lot of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think of it like any skill, whether it's triathlon or computational neuroscience or whatever. It's 10,000 reps, and start it early, get it in, it becomes a habit of mind.
There's a lot of great apps too. I know the Calm app is a great app. I use it in my classroom, and it has a visual component, so you don't really have to, as the adult or the one who's kind of running it, you don't really have to do anything. You can just kind of pick a song, and there's a visual component, and you can just kind of watch it and talk about it and say like, wow, you were feeling a little stressed, angry, anxious before. How are you feeling now that we watched this 1 minute thing? And there's a really interesting breathing exercise that you can do, and it coaches you through the whole thing that students really like. And it is free. You can pay for it, but there is a free component to it too.
In the back.
Just to jump on that, I actually teach mindfulness in schools, and it does, and we're doing that in Westwood. We just started it. My kids go to Sheehan, so we're back in Sheehan. We're doing it around test-taking anxiety. We're going before the MCAS, but just because I'll probably never see you again, so I'm just letting you know that we, there's a couple of us doing that, and we do it from we've started at 2nd grade. We can go younger, but we're sort of 2nd to 5th grade right now. But it actually just giving them those moments, those 10,000 shots, it's what I tell the kids. It's just like shooting hoops. So we're going to practice our breath, which then creates the space for the awareness for all the social situations. So absolutely start early, like anytime, and use any of those apps, because you can't have enough of it, and you have it all the time. So if they learn it, they can access it anytime. They can think better, they can learn better, they can handle the recess better. So I just want to share that with you. So sorry to
No, thank
jump
you.
in that one.
That's great. Any other questions?
I'd love to ask a follow-up question about the negative self-talk. So what are the things to look for to sort of make the determination between this is sort of a normalized negative self-talk, it's something that everybody goes through, everybody feels from time to time, versus something more serious or substantial or concerning?
Sure, I think other people can address it too, but I'll start. Can people hear me all right? So I think when you're trying to decide, is this within the range of, typical, or is this something that's more concerning? I often, like, the things we think about are like duration, frequency, and intensity. So, how often is this happening? How much of an impact is it having in the ability to get through things, or to try new things, or to kind of do the things that same age peers would be doing? So duration, intensity, and how long has this been going on, right? Is this something that feels like a phase, or is this something that feels like, well, we've been working on this for a really long time with limited or no progress? So that duration, intensity, and frequency are the kinds of things that we're looking at when a parent calls us and says, I'm not sure, if this is something that is just going to go, or if we have to, address it more heavily. I'll let other people speak to it.
And for me, the sort of artifact of the range, frequency, duration, intensity is getting to the impact of functioning. So I talk about the anticipatory anxiety being a healthy thing, but clearly there's another end. If I had such anxiety that I couldn't leave the room because I was worried about germs on the doorknob. That's going to get in the way of my functioning because my wife expects me home at some point. And so where it gets in the way of functioning, then you're like, okay, you're kind of crossing over the line. I probably need to reach out to somebody.
Just one more thing I would add is how much it's getting in the way of their bounce back, right? So if they're having a negative thought, but it's more in line with, oh, that was such a silly thing, kind of, they'll bounce back and kind of get into activities pretty quickly. But if it is such an impact that they can't bounce back from it, or it takes a lot out of them, and you start hearing kind of extremes in thinking, so this is never going to change, or this is always bad, or a big one that I listen to is, I should have done this, because they're really kind of internalizing blame. Those are kind of red flags that I look for in terms of exactly what you're both mentioning, which is the intensity, the duration, and how it's impacting their ability to function.
Other questions? Okay, we'll wrap up with our final question, which is one that we all hear often, and I think ask ourselves a lot, but it did come from a parent. How do you raise a kind and resilient child when the world around us, the media, the newspaper, the television, is filled with countless examples of cruelty, selfishness, and unfairness?
I'll jump in. One element to that. I would say cut down some of the exposure. I literally would turn on and watch the news. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and I said, I realized that after doing it for 45 minutes, I was not better off. And so I take it in little chunks, the things I need to know, and instead from whatever, 8 to 9 o'clock, I'm choosing to engage in a different activity.
Yeah, I would build up with that. Like, we talk more and more using the term like media diet, right? And thinking about other things. Like, we just have a lot of opportunities to binge things, right? And just like with food, like that can be something that feels good sometimes, but the result might not feel great. So that idea of like balancing and moderation, and noticing everybody's different. And so how does that exposure impact you and your children as individuals? Some kids might be more affected than others. One thing that I was thinking with this question was the idea that, what can you do, or, how do you raise a kind and resilient child in this situation? And I think it's like you keep doing what you're doing that works at home. And so that idea of, we all see these things that are out there, and they get a lot of attention, but really, kids use the models that are closest to them, that they see most often. So us, parents and teachers, peers, their community that they're in, those are the things that have the greatest impact on their day-to-day functioning. And so that's where we can concentrate our energy and put a lot of our time and effort.
I think those are absolutely great things to do. The only thing that I can think about, sorry. The only other thing that I can think of is that often kids are worried that things are kind of final, right? So, they made a mistake and that's how they're going to be viewed for the rest of the time. Or, the teachers are going to think that I don't know math because I failed that test. There's a sense of worry about that finality. And I think giving a message that, there are times when there are going to be mistakes, and there are times when you can repair those and we can learn from those. In the same way, we can't always stay stuck in a stage of fear, thinking everything is bad, and going out into the world expecting something bad to come. There's flexibility and there are opportunities for repair, and I think that gives them a sense of agency. Even when it might feel like things are kind of chaotic, at least there's always that sense of there's a little piece that I can influence, and there's a part that is, there's an opportunity for change. So instead of kind of walking out the door in a state of fear or anticipating something bad will happen, thinking, what can I do to kind of provide a more positive sense of how my day is going to be?
And I think also teaching children that they have a role within community, and you mentioned that before. So if some devastating, I know when the hurricanes were happening, it was very, very devastating. There are a lot of dog rescue shelters that are looking for toys. So maybe you can take some old t-shirts, braid them together, and give them to them as toys. So teaching students that they can have an impact on their community, whether it's at home, you do the dishwasher. How is that going to make mom and dad feel or grandma feel? Those small little things that they can do to really impact their world, whether their world is within their home, their town, or something greater.
And if they do want or need to talk about an event, a hurricane or something, helping shift the focus to I don't want to say the positive, but the positive responses by other people. Hey, look at all the people that went from New Orleans to help other people in Houston. I know there are actually people from New Orleans with Katrina who came up to Westwood. Isn't that great that Westwood helped out people who had the challenges from Katrina, shifting from the devastation to the positive responses?
Great. Before we end, I just want to mention again that in Westwood we have some wonderful resources. So we, as a Westwood resident, you are invited to seek referrals through a program called Interface, which is through William James College. And so that's a referral program. So if you need a referral to any type of mental health or counseling service, we can certainly there are cards here on the table that you can take and you can call the number. The schools also have that number available to you. You can always connect with Westwood Youth and Family Services, which is a great town resource, again, for Westwood residents, and please, I encourage you to take advantage of it. We have some great resources in the community. And then the schools. We have school psychologists, we have special education teachers, nurses, your classroom teachers, the principals. So there are many point people in the schools, and it's whoever you feel most comfortable with. Don't feel like you have to ask one person. It's whoever you feel comfortable with. If they don't have the information, they can certainly get that for you. We are certainly in this together. It is a partnership. We cannot do it alone without the parents' support and helping to make sure that we raise happy, healthy kids that are well-rounded and feel good about themselves and their community. And that's, I think, the goal of you as a parent and the goal of the school. And together we need to work together to make that happen. And by being here tonight, you're certainly, I'm preaching to the choir here, but thank you so much for coming out. And I'm going to turn it over to Allison Borchers to thank everybody.
I'm just doing a quick thank you so we can all applaud Donna, too, for doing a great job up here tonight. And our wonderful panelists, our school folks who are here very late in the evening. We've got principals, we've got a department head here. And I want you to know this is really a joint effort. All of the elementary principals, our preschool folks, all the psychologists, Claire and our department heads and our director of student services all have been collaborating all year thinking about this topic of social emotional development. What are we doing to support kids? What could we do more of? And how do we kind of move forward as a district and take a district that I think is already pretty invested in raising really kind, resilient, wonderful kids and do that even better. So thank you again, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and have a great evening. And thank you, Carol Morrison Deutsch, everybody, the glue that is holding my office together on a daily basis.